So I think we're ready to get started. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to those of you who are in person in Rouen, and to those of you across the country who are viewing on Zoom. My name is Arthur Urbano, Professor of Theology here at Providence College and Chair of the Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange Committee. Joining me tonight are my wonderful colleagues on the committee. Professor Vicki Templer and Father Dominic Werner are in Rouen in person, and Father John Allard is here with me on Zoom. As many of you know, the JCTE has been hosting events like this for about 13 years now. Our mission is to foster interreligious learning, understanding, and friendship between Christians and Jews. We've had many interesting and important conversations over those years and have built strong community bonds. And I'm pleased tonight that the Jewish Alliance of Greater Rhode Island is partnering with us for this extremely important discussion of anti-Semitism and interfaith partnership. Before handing things over to Professor Templer, there are two announcements I'd like to share. First, tonight's event is special as it is the first event named in honor of Faye Rozovsky. Thanks to a generous gift from the Rozovsky estate, our fall lecture will now be called the Faye Rozovsky Lecture in Jewish Catholic Dialogue. Faye was among the first women to attend Providence College. She was a prominent and influential expert in public health and medical ethics. And anyone who knew her was just drawn in by her enthusiasm, her friendliness, and the joy that she had for life. Faye and her late husband, Lorne, were among the first supporters of this program. And while they were in the area, they attended regularly, and I had the great pleasure of many conversations with them about faith, the Bible, the rabbis, ethics, and of course, the friars. Faye was a very proud friar, and she served as vice president and president of the Providence College National Alumni Association from 2009 to 2012. She once told me she was asked why, as a Jewish woman, she would even want to serve as the Alumni Association president of a Catholic college. Well, she laughed and said she responded by saying, "Why not?" And quoting the words of her late mentor and friend, Father John Peterson, Providence College is a big tent and we have room for everyone. And really, it's in that spirit that we're proud to name this lecture in her honor. And we're happy to have Faye's sister, Dr. Anne Frank Goldstein, and her son, Joshua Rozovsky, with us tonight, both also PC grads. And we also extend our best wishes to Faye's son, Rabbi Aaron Rozovsky, and his family. The second announcement is also an exciting one. I'm happy to announce that PC is instituting a new Scholar in Residence program in Jewish Studies and Jewish Catholic Relations, an outcome of the work of the JCTE committee. So we hope to bring the finest scholars in Jewish Studies here to Providence to enhance our curriculum and give students and faculty opportunities to learn about and engage in interreligious dialogue. If you're interested in learning more about the Scholar in Residence program, you can go to careers.providence.edu. Tonight's event is being recorded, will be available on our website in the near future, jews-catholics.providence.edu. So the way things will work tonight, each of our panelists will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. Then they'll have the opportunity to react and respond to each other. And then we'll open the floor for Q&A. And if you're tuning in via Zoom, I invite you to place your questions at any point in the Q&A feature. And Father John Allard and I will present those questions to the panelists. So without further delay, and again, another apology for the delay in starting, I'll hand things over to Vicki, who will introduce our topic and our panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Urbano. So welcome, everyone. Our topic is a discussion on interfaith discussion on anti-Semitism. So it's a very timely event. I thank you all for coming, to our panelists, everyone that's here on Zoom. So I'm going to just go ahead and introduce the panelists. What I'll do is I'll introduce, starting with Rabbi Fish, and he'll give a approximately 10-minute background, tell us what we should know, and then we'll move on to Stephanie and then Father Palakowski. So Rabbi Ron Fish serves in the Anti-Defamation League as the Eastern Division Director of Anti-Semitism, Education, and Advocacy. He is a graduate of Brandeis University and the Jewish Theological Seminary. He has served as a congregational rabbi in 3 communities in the Northeast for 25 years. He is a member of the executive committee of the Massachusetts Board of Rabbis and has worked through the years as a committed and enthusiastic partner for interfaith dialogue. His primary task is to address anti-Semitism on college campuses and to offer support for Jewish communities during those first few years of adolescent independence on campuses from Maine to Delaware. Welcome, Rabbi Fish.
Thank you very much. Good to see some friends. I see Rabbi Franklin here. It's good to be in Providence. I was just saying I've been to Providence many times. I live in Sharon, so it's not too far, except apparently at rush hour. But it's a beautiful place. I've never been to Providence College before, so it's wonderful to be here, and I'm so honored to share the podium with my colleagues. There's a Jewish tradition, a kind of a mystical tradition that suggests every Jew should have 2 pockets. In one pocket should be written the verse, "You are dust, and unto dust you return," a little scrap of paper that reminds us to be humble. And a second scrap of paper we are supposed to write on there, "Vatachasrehu me'at me'elohim," you're just a little smidge less significant than the angels themselves. That you are, as a human being, made essentially of God's stuff, not of earth stuff. So those 2 ideas are supposed to keep you humble and keep you proud, all at the same time. I think that applies here as well. Maybe the Dickens line, "The best of times, it was the worst of times," is a good framing also. We're sitting in America in the 21st century, and as we look back, this has been the greatest period for the Jewish people in terms of our integration into the broader society, having the most opportunities, having the most blessings of pretty much anywhere for the last 2,000 years. This experiment in democracy, with its stumbles along the way, has always been, with some notable exceptions, a place that stood out in our memory and in our history as a place and a time of integration, acceptance, success, where the story of anti-Semitism seemed to be receding. And yet, as we sit here tonight, the Anti-Defamation League has recently released data that shows an enormous spike in anti-Semitic acts. 34% spike just over the past year. We are living just 4 years after the greatest massacre of Jews in American history for the sin of being Jews. And we are living in the same year, happened in 2022, that those 11 shoppers at Tops Supermarket in Buffalo, when they were murdered, those African Americans, they were murdered because in the fevered mind of the perpetrator of that horrific crime, they were being brought specifically by Jews to replace somehow his understanding of the real people who deserved this land, white Christians, I guess. We live at a time where the past occupant of the Oval Office, I must say, opened a Pandora's box by saying they're fine people on both sides, when one of those sides included people wearing swastikas and calling out, "Jews will not replace us." And we live at a time where on many college campuses, you will hear Zionists out. You will hear that Jews have somehow to respond as if we are sitting in the accused box in court. We have to respond to every accusation about the behavior of the state of Israel, real or imagined. And every individual Jew and every individual Jewish community somehow is being told they are required to account. On a couple of college campuses recently here in the Northeast, young women who were part of sexual assault survivors groups were told they were not welcome because they had posted Zionist identity on Facebook. The bleakness of the story that I tell is in contrast to the uplifting story of American history, but they're both true. They're both true. And one just has to watch Twitter feeds and comments on social media from people like Kanye West, Ye, who has double the number of followers on Twitter as there are the number of Jews in the world. When he says he's going to go DEFCON 3 on the Jews, whatever that means. But we can't help in the Jewish community but hear those facts, see those events, read those tweets. We can't help but see those and think, is something fundamental shifting? Is something different happening today? So one of the things I try to do as I go to college campuses all over the East is I try to teach both, by the way, Jewish students who don't understand the phenomenon of anti-Semitism, and also well-meaning but ultimately uninformed directors of equity and inclusion, DEIs, or others who serve in university capacities. I try to teach both of them that the antiquity we recall, persecutions, the Inquisition, expulsions, viewing Jews suspiciously as if there is an international conspiracy combining together to undermine the good of humanity, the Jews, those tropes which existed, we thought, in the past and sat there quietly, we know now don't. Those tropes exist and perpetuate themselves over time, even as they morph and change. And at ADL, we do what we can to teach the American population, the American Jewish community. We try to explain to law enforcement, and we try to explain to political leaders what it looks like when we perceive these tropes reemerging and presenting real danger. So historically, there was a belief that Jews somehow are different from other people. There's always been suspicion between one group and another. That's probably as old as there are human beings, and maybe whoever figured out how to make the first flag or the first way to wear a particular form of clothing or a toga, maybe there was always animosity between groups. But there was something different that changed with regard to Jews historically. Jews were seen in some measure as being the source of evil in the world that affected the entire planet and the entire cosmos, perhaps, in ways that no other people could. That idea emerged in some ways because of the rejection of Jesus that was seen to be a core revolt against God. Early on in the history of the Christian world, there was a question about what the relationship should be between this new group, originally a group of Jews who were kind of an alternative path to serve God with the same history, the same holy book, the same tradition, but now with a belief that the Savior had come. How that break-off group would see the community from which they emerged. There were those who said the Jews should no longer be. Along came St. Augustine and said, no, do not eliminate the Jews. We must not do that. And Augustine's view preserved, in some ways, the Jewish community of Christendom for more than 1,000 years. His view was that the Jews were a link to a past that was necessary for the Christian community to remember. It wasn't an easy position to be in because, according to Augustine, the Jewish community needed to be reminded it was not any longer God's chosen people because of the sin of having rejected Jesus. But at the same time, it was a protected state. And for most of the history of Jews in Christendom, at least in those communities where Augustine's view prevailed, Jews lived in relative safety. In fact, sometimes there were local communities that were agitated against Jews, and it was the church that came to the protection of the Jews. It was a local bishop, or it was even a cardinal who came and protected Jewish communities. That phenomenon was thrown aside from time to time. During the Crusades and during the Inquisition, there were all-out attempts to address this problem. And again, Jews faced expulsion. Not because they were just a different group, but because there was this feeling, this concern, that there was, in some ways, something beyond their numbers and beyond their worldly power, which the Jews could do. That idea persisted and morphed and changed. It became expressed through antagonism toward Jews as capitalists in some communities, where there was a view that the Jews were taking advantage of their position, one they were given often by a local prince or duke or king. Sometimes it morphed into a view of Jews as being only interested in themselves and not interested in the larger communities in which they dwelt. And sometimes it was a view that Jews were communists and were seeking to overturn the whole world order for their own benefit. It's an amazing thing if you think about it, how Jews could be accused of being superstitious and backward or too cosmopolitan and worldly. They could be accused of being capitalists, and they could be accused of being communists. They could be accused of being this and the opposite because it didn't matter. What mattered was there was a continuous perceived view of the Jew as somehow powerful beyond his numbers and interested only in destroying the world that was being built. Obviously, the 20th century is the moment of greatest Jewish vulnerability, when it was not in the Tsar's Russia, where Jews had lived for centuries in fear, but there was an understanding it was a religiously embodied state. It was not in the Middle East, where there was plenty of tension through the years with Islam and with Muslim communities and rulers. It was in the heart of the modern world, in Germany, where Jews had flourished in the universities, where Jews had flourished in becoming part of the society. In my first synagogue in West Hartford, my predecessor in that congregation, his father proudly was among the Jews listed who died for Germany, fighting for the fatherland in World War I. That kind of love for Germany on every level was what made Jews believe it was impossible to imagine that this idea persisted even there, even then. And without doing the disservice of telling the story of the Holocaust, which I assume many of you are familiar with in a couple of sentences, I will simply say what we, the Jewish community, have learned in the 20th century makes Jews today, even though there are so many good stories to tell about American Jewish history, it makes us worry that what we are seeing today might be a shift again. I would say the biggest reason I am encouraged that we're not is because we sit together here today. Because Jews and Christians and Jews and Muslims work together. Because organizations like ADL have so many alliances across the spectrum that we can push back together against hate from wherever it comes. I'll leave my introductory words there, but I want everybody to remember you have those two slips of paper in your proverbial pocket as well. We can all feel powerless. What can I do about this problem? And if we only focus on that one slip of paper on that one side of the equation, we will allow others to take the reins at this difficult and transitional moment in American history. You have that other slip of paper too. You have great power. And the power is the power of love, of empathy, of compassion. You have the power to look beyond narrow boundaries and to see all human beings as part of your family. And it is within your power to bring small moments of redemption to a world that needs it. We don't live in social media. We live in human relationships, and we can push back when we care enough to extend our hand. Thank you.
Rabbi Fish. Next, we're going to move right along to Stephanie Hague. Stephanie is the Chief Policy Officer at the Jewish Alliance of Greater Rhode Island. In her role, she oversees public policy, government relations, anti-Semitism, security, social justice, and interfaith partnerships in the organization. She, prior to her role, she worked at the Associated, the Jewish Community Federation of Baltimore, where she oversaw international partnerships and funding relationships in Ukraine and Israel. She has an undergraduate degree from New York University and a master's in public policy from Northwestern University. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Urbano and Dr. Templer-Rotko, also known as my friend Vicky. So I was like not exactly sure how to refer to her, but thank you for inviting me to be here tonight. You know, I'm sitting with these two distinguished clergy. I know we have many clergy in the audience, and I'm really here today to share a bit more of the local story. I'm looking in the audience. I see many of our own Jewish community members here also, which is great. So, you know, I think I encourage, like Rabbi Fish was just saying, it's about relationships. And, you know, if you could walk away from anything from tonight, I hope it's that you know, build a relationship with someone of a different faith, a different background too, because that's how, you know, you really get to learn about a community. So I'm just going to share a little bit about what's going on locally. And there we go. So, you know, I speak on anti-Semitism a bit in the community, and I've changed my presentation recently because I really want to start off every time I talk about anti-Semitism locally by talking about all the great things about the local Jewish community. Because if you walk away from tonight's presentation thinking, oh, the Jewish community is hiding away and not coming out and not living openly and Jewishly, you know, that's not the right picture to paint of the Jewish community. And not really telling our full story. You know, and the Jewish community here is thriving. There's a lot going on. There's many exciting things going on, and Jewish or not, there's many opportunities that would welcome you all to come and participate. You know, and the other piece is there's no one Jew. Jews look very different. Rhode Island is not unique. Jews are a racially, ethnically, religiously, geographically diverse people. And we are not a monolith, even though there are not many of us, about 14 million in the world. No one Jew is the same. So, you know, when you're talking about the Jewish community, it's, you know, not really a fair representation to say, you know, one Jewish person, you know them all. So I encourage you to kind of go out, meet your local Jewish community, make some local Jewish friends, and that to me would be like a great way to walk out of tonight's presentation. So what is happening? Oh, wait. Oh, sorry. Okay, so this is me as Stephanie, a Jewish person, you know, also here that says someone who goes around and talks on Judaism and anti-Semitism. These are kind of some of my guiding things I like to think about when I talk about anti-Semitism. You know, for the Jewish people in this room, you may have your own. These are some of the things I like to guide my conversations, especially with non-Jews, especially when I'm engaging in a conversation on anti-Semitism. The first is we have to condemn anti-Semitism, no matter who it comes from, no matter where it comes from. I think we've seen a big increase in, you know, political division on anti-Semitism. To me, it doesn't really matter. We could get into those debates, but, you know, that to me is a really important point. The second is anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. It is something that affects us, but it is a societal problem. Like I said, we are 2% of the Rhode Island population, 2% of the US population. Simply, we can't address it alone. You know, we wouldn't be successful in addressing it alone, and we shouldn't have to address it alone. Other communities that are marginalized, we don't put that on that community and say, that's your problem, go deal with it, you know, enjoy. And I think we as the Jewish community, you know, we need people to partner with us, and we need people to view this as a larger societal issue. The third piece is that the Jewish community gets to decide what is and isn't anti-Semitic. Once again, there may be debate amongst the Jewish community about what is and isn't anti-Semitic, but we ultimately get to guide that decision. And And different Jews experience anti-Semitism very differently. Jews, like everyone else, like I said, there are non-white Jews, there are queer Jews, there are Jews who are visibly Jewish when they walk down the street. They are all going to have different lived experiences of what it means to be targeted as a Jew. Like Rabbi Fish was saying, college campuses, a Zionist identity, all of those things, create a complex Jewish identity, and people are going to experience anti-Semitism differently because of that. And lastly, I hope you all care about anti-Semitism because it's innately bad, but also we've seen that anti-Semitism is what we call a canary in the coal mine, which is a term, I've really only heard in this context, but essentially that, anti-Semitism is kind of the first shoe to drop when it comes to hatred, and that we're kind of, when you see anti-Semitism growing, it means that we're being, the first group to be targeted in certain societies. So those are kind of my like truisms on anti-Semitism. When I'm talking about this and going out in the community, those are things that I really like to guide the conversation. So what is happening locally? So you can see up on the screen here, and like Rabbi Fish said, unfortunately, this is a growth industry. I wish that weren't the case, but it is. What you'll see here are local images from things that have happened in Rhode Island. They're all essentially propaganda or vandalism, but that's simply because those are the things that are easy to photograph. So, we have seen, just like nationally, a large increase in anti-Semitic incidents. We've also really increased our reporting amongst the Jewish community. So, the numbers might be skewed slightly because people have been reporting incidents more. But I have been in this role for about 5 years, and I can say anecdotally there's just been a huge increase in incidents. From just in the last month, we've had students or families report from local schools about kids coming in, Kanye was right, things like that. Just a couple nights ago in Warwick, there were about 300 of these flyers distributed on people's front lawns, not targeted at the Jewish community, but most likely distributed by the Goyim Defense League, which is a white supremacist anti-Jewish hate group that is growing their presence in New England. And I get reports from schools, workplaces, particularly visibly Jewish people walking down the street, people saying things to them. So, this is something that is really growing. It's concerning to people. And I think if you're Jewish and living in this community, you feel that, and you're scared about that. And I'm really, it's so hard not to talk about Kanye West right now, but I'm really going to try not to. But what I will say is that when we say things like it's just rhetoric, it's just social media, fill in the blank, this is a real life thing that's happening. So there is a trickle-down effect to the local community. So if you, Jewish, not Jewish, you wake up in the morning and you go on onto your front lawn and you see that, that is because of Kanye West. So now we're seeing this kind of horseshoe of a Kanye West situation over here, a white supremacist anti-Semitic hate group over here, and now suddenly they have this, connector between them. So, when people say it's just this, it's just that, I say, well, you know what, this is what we're seeing here in our community. So I think there, is certainly reason to be concerned. And at the same time, at the Jewish Alliance, we work very closely with all levels of law enforcement, and we are very lucky that there really isn't an acute threat to our Jewish community. So, we're kind of like Rabbi Fish was saying, in this balance of acknowledging that things are really not great right now, and at the same time, we want people going out, living Jewishly, being comfortable going into their Jewish spaces. So this is I just want to talk a little bit about some of the positive things that are happening around how we're addressing anti-Semitism locally. And you'll see that, we kind of take both sides of this issue. The first is we address anti-Semitism uniquely. We participate in things like this, of course. We work with schools, businesses, either in response to an incident that happens, but also ideally proactively in the community with them to educate them. We work with law enforcement, elected officials, civic leaders, our federal delegation. Here's us with Congressman Cicilline, who I'm sure many of you know. But we're very lucky here that our elected officials care about this issue, want to engage on it. The other side is, like we said, this is not an issue we can address alone. So we also work in partnership with other marginalized groups to address hate more broadly in the state. And unfortunately, they are experiencing similar effects in their community. It shows itself in different ways, but we're partnering with them as well. And I'm excited that we're planning a joint statewide anti-hate summit at Rhode Island College in May. Hopefully some of you will be able to join us, but we're doing that in partnership with other marginalized populations. And the last piece is around security. This is obviously a huge importance to the Jewish community, and we have benefited from a lot of federal and private dollars to make our Jewish community spaces, candidly, probably some of the safest buildings in the state. And at the same time, we do that to foster the community, not hinder the community. So we like to create security in a way that doesn't make people want to run away scared. Many of you maybe have traveled to Europe, visited synagogues there. You know what it's like when you go there. There's people with armed guards at the doors, and they're looking at your passports. That is not what we're looking to do here, but we also want to support the local Jewish community in staying safe. So, just trying to remember what I have up here. Okay, so a lot of times, especially what's going on now, I wish more people were reaching out saying, what does it mean to be an ally to the Jews? But once again, these are some of the guiding principles that I like to encourage, either personally with non-Jewish friends or family members or colleagues, but also as an organization, what we're looking for. So, the unfortunate thing is the situation with Kanye West or Kyrie Irving or with the flyerings, those are going to come and go. People are going to forget about them. There'll be another incident that will happen at some point. I would love people to show up for the Jewish community all the time, no matter what's going on. And also come, like I said, to some of the more positive, interesting things that are happening in our community. Concerts, speakers, family events. Many are not religious necessarily in nature, they're cultural in nature, and you would be welcome to come and learn and support your local Jewish community. Education, you're all doing that now, but I think there's two parts of this. The first, like I said, is to educate yourself about Jewish history, the Jewish community. I think probably whatever you think about Judaism, if you are not Jewish, even if you are Jewish, there's probably a lot more to learn. And also learn about anti-Semitic tropes in history. It's complicated. It's not always black and white. The ADL, the United States Holocaust Museum, they all have excellent resources, films, articles you can read to learn more about this. Like I said, calling out anti-Semitism, no matter where it comes from, listening and centering Jewish voices and letting the Jewish community decide what is and isn't anti-Semitic. The last piece, we could spend many hours talking about Israel, talking about the conflict in the Middle East. That is not what this conversation is about. We're talking about local American Jews, and when people make the conversation about Israel, they make the conversation about the Middle East, they're ignoring, they're pushing aside what's happening in the lived experience of American Jews. So don't make the conversation about Israel. Trust me, we could talk a lot about that at another time, but that's a totally separate conversation than, what we're here to talk about today. So that's all I had for you. This is my contact information. I encourage anyone to reach out. You can scan, this is me trying to be hip and cool. You can scan our QR code. This will take you to the Jewish Alliance's Facebook page. If you follow us there, you can learn about some of the events I was telling you about, and also you could connect with a local synagogue, a local Jewish family. That's really my big takeaway, is to learn from your local Jewish friends and neighbors, and hopefully we can address this before the problem gets any larger. So thank you. Thank you. I don't know if it works, but.
Okay, next we have Father John Palakowski. Father John is a member of the Order of Friar Servants of Mary and was ordained as the University of St. Mary of the Lake. One of the founding faculty members of CTU, he served on the faculty from 1968 until his retirement in 2017. John has been an active participant in the Christian-Jewish dialogue as well as the wider interreligious dialogue for nearly 50 years. He served for 6 years as president of the International Council of Christians and Jews and has served several terms on the board of the Parliament of the World's Religions. He was deeply involved in the development of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, having served 4 terms on its board by presidential appointment. Welcome, Father John.
Well, thank you very much. It is indeed an honor to be here at Providence College, pardon me, and to be able, first of all, to express my admiration for the work that's being done here. I'm one of the founders of something called the Council of Centers for Christian-Jewish Dialogue, and Providence College Center in that area has been an important partner in our efforts over the years. And so that's due in a large part to the very dedicated work of Dr. Urbano, and who has made an impact well beyond Boston College, well beyond Providence College. That's a bad slip here. But anyway, I wanted to offer that bit of testimony. Let me also begin by mentioning important testimony from another citizen of this great city. And I think of my colleague under whom I was instructed in many ways early on in my career in issues of the Catholic-Jewish relationship. And I speak of Father Edward Flannery. Father Flannery, I think, showed very clearly in his groundbreaking volume, The Anguish of the Jews, the first real history of the treatment of Jews throughout Christian history, and concluded that probably close to 1 million Jews died over the centuries because of this theology that the Jews had been eliminated from the covenant and were made to be marginal and were to be saved as marginal and miserable in human society. On this point, I guess I would take a little different approach than my colleague Rabbi Fish. Yes, Augustine is to be credited for, in one sense, saving the Jews. But how did he anticipate the Jews would live as they were being saved? Very much in a miserable and marginal situation with no real rights or, if you want to use the term, power in society. Paula Friedrichsen, the great scholar, has written a major book on Augustine, and she is correct in asserting his role in saving the Jews against those who would simply want to physically eliminate them. But on the other hand, I would be somewhat critical of her approach because I think it fails to really acknowledge that at the heart of Augustine's theory, which is often called the adversus Judaios theory, that he really saved Jews, but in a way that left them at the powerless and marginal in society. And as a result, what happened? What happened was the close to 1 million people who died in the course of history. Now, Augustine may have had some limitations on how you could, quote unquote, punish Jews for not accepting Christ, but the purpose for him keeping Jews alive was not so much that he loved Jews or respected Jews. It was far more that he wanted Jews to be a visible symbol for what happens to you if you don't accept Jesus Christ. And that's, there's no doubt that part of the, while Augustine may have had urged restraints on Jews, certainly he was not a Nazi in the Hitlerian sense, in any sense of the word. But nonetheless, I think what he proposed led many people to go beyond his boundaries and really led to the actual extermination of the Jews. And even in the Holocaust, while the Holocaust is a complex phenomenon from the standpoint of ideology and so on, there's no doubt in my mind that at least the acquiescence, if not the outright collaboration of ordinary Christians in the Nazi effort was due primarily to what they had learned about Jews and Judaism in their Christian tradition. Hitler was not entirely incorrect when he told a group of visiting bishops who complained about anti-Semitism. He said, you know, I'm only putting into practice what you've been teaching for thousands of years. And of course, Hitler urged many people to visit the Oberammergau Passion Play as a way of enhancing support for his own ideology and his own concrete persecution of the Jews. Now, let me just comment there, lest I be misunderstood. The Oberammergau play is a marvelous example of what can be done to change the historic story. I can't go into this, but the present director over the last about 20 years or so has really made profound changes which eliminate the old stereotypes by and large and really actually move in the direction of almost a kind of philo-Judaism in part. So that actually can be seen as a positive development. But there are other ways in which the historic Christian tradition has enhanced anti-Semitism. We have to look at the New Testament. One of the passages in the Gospel of John speaks of Jews as having the devil as their father, condemns Jews in the worst possible vitriolic language. Now, scripture scholars today, and I'm sure Dr. Urbano would approve of this, including the great scripture scholar Raymond Brown, has said very clearly and decisively that that kind of biblical statement cannot be the basis for catechesis and preaching in our day. And I think it basically isn't. But even more importantly, in some ways, than this picture of Jews presented in the Gospel of John is, in fact, the picture of the Pharisees. The Pharisees have been portrayed as the arch enemies of Jesus. In some ways, while they were only one of the Jewish movements of the time, a movement which actually the Vatican in 1985 said was the most influential Jewish movement of the day on Jesus' teaching and ethics and so on. But the Pharisees are often presented as sort of representing the Jewish community as a whole. And I have to say, who has not heard in the Christian service on more than one occasion the denunciation of the Pharisees as the arch enemies of Jesus? And that, I think, has also been a continuing, I would say continuing, unfortunately, aspect of the development of a kind of at least anti-Judaic attitude among Christian believers, which in turn can be easily transformed into social, political anti-Semitism. I think we also have to look at the, let me just say again, on the Pharisees, Pope Francis has done a good thing here because in a presentation he made to an international conference on Pharisaism in Rome in 2019, he strongly urged Christians to become better acquainted with the complexity of Pharisaism and the positive implications of their viewpoint on the fundamental teaching of Jesus. And that really is, important step. And there is that particular conference produced a volume edited by Professor Amy Jo Levine and Father Joseph Sievers of the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, that Pontifical Biblical Institute, which anyone who wants the latest understanding of Phariseeism really needs to consult. The history of Christian anti-Semitism, whether during the Crusades, but even, I think, on the Catholic side in particular, if we examine the policies of some of you may not know, or even if you're Catholic, that at one point, the Catholic Church, the Vatican, was in fact a nation state, not in the way that it is today as this mini-state, a very mini-state, smallest of the mini-states, but a considerable nation of considerable size before the unification of Italy. And when you look at the legislation that was developed while the Vatican was a political power in the social political arena, you will find that many of the theological attitudes towards Jews and Judaism got translated into a lack of powerlessness and marginality for the Jewish community at that time. I think one good thing to report today is that at least at the level of church leadership, whether that leadership be more progressively inclined or more conservatively inclined, there have been strong statements against anti-Semitism. Pope John Paul II, in his book, Crossing the Threshold, declared that anti-Semitism is a sin. And some Polish priests told me that right after that, actually, people came into the confessional for the sacrament of penance and actually confessed anti-Semitism. I'm not sure whether that prevails anymore, but it was an interesting, concrete development. But there's also a disturbing side to, if you want, Catholic anti-Semitism. A recent issue of the very influential and important journal Commonweal carried an article on the growth of anti-Semitism among Catholic organizations on the web. And this is something that we have to pay much more attention to. Now, some of the groups that are pushing this are very marginal and even outside of official Catholicism. But nonetheless, all sorts of other people who don't know very much about the status of these groups and the current teaching, official teaching of the Catholic Church on Catholic-Jewish relations may well buy into this kind of malarkey, if you want, or these falsehoods that are presented there. And so that's really an area that I think those of us in the dialogue have not done enough homework on, and I think we need to pay much greater attention in that area. So I do think that we've made significant progress, but there is really a challenge that is facing us anew as anti-Semitism becomes more normal, if you want, in U.S. society, but also globally. I was very concerned a few weeks ago when I noticed that the very controversial Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, designated one Vladimir Putin as an exorcist for Ukraine. That means he was supposed to remove the devil from Ukraine. And with the images of Jews classically as being connected with the devil, and that was very much part of Oberammergau in the old days, I think that kind of manifestation is worrisome at the least. So let me just end by saying, you know, some of you may be aware of a rather well-known story that has made the rounds in Christian-Jewish relations, and of course it's about the Jewish person who says to another, a Christian person who says to a Jewish person, well, I'm getting mixed up. A Jewish person, a Christian person, speaking with a Christian friend, says, "Do you love me?" And the Christian says, "Sure, sure, I love you very much." And the Jewish friend repeats it. And suddenly, the Christian gets a little annoyed because he's affirming that he loves him. And he said, "Do you know what hurts me?" And I think what we Christians really need to realize today is that, I don't know if I use the word hurt, but there is new concern, as Rabbi Fish has already indicated, new apprehension about even the Jewish role in contemporary American society. I read a rather strong opinion piece by Dana Wilbanks recently, in which he said this is the first time he can recall when Jews are asking the question that maybe America is no longer a safe place. But then he says, where would we go? And he concludes by saying, no, we must stay here and continue the fight for our democratic tradition, which has certainly, if not perfectly, undercut the power of anti-Semitism in social political context that prevailed over the centuries. So that's what I think we need as Christians to join our Jewish brothers and sisters in that effort. And in fact, the Vatican and Israel have pledged to cooperate in that area. That was really in the preface. They stated that joint commitment in the preface to what is called the Fundamental Agreement, which established formal diplomatic relations between the Holy See and the State of Israel. So I'll end there, and thank you very much.
So I just want to open up, thank you, all of you did a great job. This was so interesting. I want to open up the panel so the panelists have an opportunity to ask each other questions, and then we have such a wonderful audience of students, of administrators, of community members, of friars, of rabbis. So I want to open it up to all of you, but first I want to give the panelists an opportunity to ask each other questions.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. First, I want to just say how powerful and how moving it is to hear a scholar of your depth and background speaking from a place of deep conviction, obviously, about your Christian faith, to unpack that history. It is, the term, I'm not even sure how long people knew this term, but certainly it's out there now. There's a gaslighting that I think some of interfaith dialogue feels like sometimes, where we sit together and break bread and tell good stories about our relationship. And it's been difficult, I think, to touch some of the core pieces of the story that has caused historic pain between Jews and Christians. And it is like a weight lifted off of one's shoulders to hear a Catholic leader speak with such clarity and such historical knowledge. And I guess if there's a question in there, the question is, do you feel that that outside of the issues which you've already touched on social media or other kind of online spaces, do you feel that your view is prevalent in the way the seminaries train people today within both the professional and the lay communities of the Catholic leadership to come? Or is your voice representing a kind of a high point that is not actually in vogue today?
Well, I would say it's not 100% in vogue, to be sure. But I think there, parts of my viewpoint have been incorporated. I began my work really doing a book called Catechetics and Prejudice on the studies that had which were actually a tripartite effort of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews under the aegis of the Ford Foundation back in the late 50s, early 60s. And the Catholic studies were done at St. Louis University by 3 nuns, including the well-known Sister Rose Thiering. They really led to a change fundamental change in Catholic textbooks. The Protestant picture is somewhat more mixed because, again, we're talking about, there isn't a Protestant church. There are lots of Protestant denominations, and each has its own governing structure. So my colleague, first of all, there was a follow-up to my book by Dr. Eugene Fisher, and then another follow-up by Dr. Philip Cunningham. We actually haven't had a significant study of textbooks for quite some time, and I'm hoping that some doctoral student might get interested in this again, because to really see and assess where we are. On the Protestant side, the much more limited evaluation following the original study that was done at Yale University showed some backsliding. At this point, I would say that the example that I mentioned about the social media could, right now, the material that's out there from the average, in terms of where Catholicism on the whole is pretty marginal. But that doesn't mean that people tuning in with very little background to what the church has said on this issue, how it's changed, might not buy into those. Will that stuff that's on the social media become normative again in some sense, or at least acceptable in more less marginal circles? So I think we really need to take action before something like that happens and make it very clear. So I would say I think Pope Francis has certainly advanced the dialogue. He's not 100% perfect. He stepped into some unfortunate statements which were written for him, but nonetheless he gave them and gave his a kind of stamp over them. So we'll have to see. But I mean, certainly one of the problems with Pope Francis is, I think Pope Francis, and let me tell you, I'm a strong supporter of him, but one of the issues, he doesn't have a whole lot of interest in profound theological analysis. He'd rather cook a kosher breakfast for a visiting group of rabbis than get into some of these issues.
Not many of us would turn down a good kosher breakfast.
So I mean, but there is progress. I'd have to be, if I really want to be very candid. A number of us in who have been deeply involved in Catholic Jewish relations over decades in some cases feel that there's a certain amount of stagnation that has set in to the Holy See's Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews, which is the primary body responsible for Vatican relations with their equivalents like Ichkik and so on. That is a widely held view among many of us in the Catholic. So I'm being brutally honest here.
One of the things I think to keep in mind is that the worst atrocity in Jewish history was undertaken, I think in a certain sense, outside of the bounds of any recognizable religious structure. So there is a permission structure that's created, I think, over time that we've been talking about here in terms of the enduring quality of these tropes. And that permission structure is, at some level, a core motivator. But the things that hyper motivated the persecutions of the 20th century seem to be, and actually I think this is where we need to be most cautious in our moment right now in America, seem to be this hyper-nationalism plugged into those tropes. This sense of being displaced, of feeling communities that are fearing, in some ways, maybe a rational analysis would say fictionally, but nonetheless, genuinely, those communities are feeling being displaced. And so when you plug this kind of nationalist agenda into these long-standing tropes, you see a kind of a hyper-motivated version of persecution. And of course, it's critical to say that the Jewish community is not the only target. I think you're right. The canary in the coal mine is one way to think about it. But what we're seeing in terms of AAPI violence against Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, when we see that the Oath Keepers are threatening LGBTQ plus Americans, including potentially organizing for literal acts of mass violence against pride parades, when we see the kinds of expressions of extreme passion that spilled over into violence at the Capitol on January 6th 2 years ago, we see what it could look like, even in America, when things are plugged in. And the tropes, the motifs, the theology, which I am passionate about as well, when the theology becomes weaponized. And so I think that there's a great deal of soul-searching everybody needs to do. Every community needs to look with honest eyes at our religious texts. But I think also there's something else afoot as well.
Maybe just I would add to your comments. I think what I see the Jewish community in some cases not fully understanding is the profound change in church governance and church leadership that Pope Francis is promoting. And therefore, yes, it's important to know what people are teaching to seminarians, but more and more lay people have, and probably if the synod, the model of the synod that Pope Francis is pushing does succeed, there's going to be a significant new role in leadership on the part of lay people. And I think that has to be recognized, and that also has to be transformed into education. As one who has done parish synagogue programming in the Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish communities, I'm almost always amazed and disheartened in a way at the lack of interest in primary and high school education in the faith on the part of Catholics. Now, a lot of that may be true because of our blue-collar heritage in American Catholicism, and that's something. If the synod model is going to succeed, it's going to have to succeed with a considerable new emphasis on adult education and not just on catechetical classes for primary and secondary school students. Now, behind what Francis is doing has to be understood too. The basic theological foundation for Francis has shifted. Governance and leadership in the church was heavily tied to the sacrament of holy orders, and therefore the clerical dimension. But Francis has said it is rooted far more in the sacrament of baptism, which all members of the church share in. And not many people realize, I think, the full implications of what that theological change, which undergirds a great deal of what is moving the synod process in the eyes of Pope Francis.
Fascinating.
We should open it up to the audience. There's also, you're also welcome to have post questions in the chat if you are online. I think Father Dominic's going to be helping with that. But if you have questions, please ask, and I will bring you the mic. And also feel free for, you know, the panelists to continue speaking.
Thank you. Hi. My name's Shoshana Brown. I'm a cantor in Fall River. I saw an interesting article in the New York Times yesterday, and I'm still trying to understand it. It was about the resurgence of popularity of the Latin Mass, and being a Jew who prays in Hebrew, and also knowing a lot about music and knowing how many beautiful pieces, you know, masses have been written in Latin, I think, what could be wrong with that? But as I read the articles, there seems to be this implication, but it's never spelled out, that there's some tie between the popularity of the Latin Mass and a right-wing reactionary thing that's dangerous for, I guess, people who don't fit into a certain box. I mean, then I started looking on the web for all these other things about the Latin Mass, and they all have this kind of implication, but it's not spelled out. And I don't know if this has any danger for the Jews. It probably has some danger for LGBTQ, but I wonder if any Catholic person here could explain this to me.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. You have raised a very, very disputed issue, largely resulting from the strong clampdown, if you want, on Latin Mass by Pope Francis over against his predecessor, who gave a certain new opportunity for people promoting the Latin Mass. This is a very complex argument. The argument of Pope Francis is indeed that in most cases, the effort to promote the Latin Mass is very closely tied to the rejection of many of the values of the Second Vatican Council. And that, therefore, he has come down quite hard on it. There is not to be any more promotion of and training people for the Latin Mass. The Latin Mass is really supposed to be just an option for mostly older people who spend their whole lives in that context, and it's too hard for them to change, but it should not be promoted. Now, for example, in the Archdiocese of Chicago, where I am, we have a very large parish. In fact, it's the parish where my baptismal credentials are. Cardinal Supich has clamped down some, but he's not said, you know, you have to stop it. This gets also very much into the discussion, the liturgical discussion of what the Catholic Mass should be and of its ties, say, to the meal tradition in Second Temple Judaism. Much of the Latin liturgy, while it's beautiful music, can become more of a concert than a participatory activity on the part of the congregation. There's nothing wrong with good listening to good sacred music, but is it what the liturgy should be about? The liturgy, historically in Catholicism, took on many of the trappings of the imperial court and the celebrations connected with the imperial court over the centuries. So that's giving just a little bit of where the discussion is. It's much more profound, and I suspect the discussion won't end tomorrow. So,
But to be specific, does the Latin Mass quote, I think it's Matthew, where the Jews say, his blood on us and our descendants forever?
well, I don't know if that reading is in it. One of the issues is that on Good Friday, the text that was substituted by Pope Benedict, which took away the worst gutter language that was associated with that. But nonetheless, still the 1970 post-Vatican II missal that was issued under Pope Paul VI for the, on Good Friday, the Jews are remembered in prayer. That prayer under the 1970 missal was very, did not affirm in any sense the need for Jewish conversion in order to be saved. Benedict's reworking of the text of the Latin Mass brings a sort of conversionist notion back, and now how it's a small number of people that actually participate in that, and if Francis is successful in what he set out to do, even fewer people will be participating in Latin Masses, at least in official Catholicism. As you know, there are breakaway groups that are not formally tied to the Vatican anymore, which promote this,
Right.
and people can, the Society of St. Pius X, for example.
I think for Jews it's often very surprising how often we come up in traditional Christian prayer. Jews obviously played a very significant role in the story of Jesus as a human being, as his context, and the Jewish people continue to be a direct community for conversion efforts by the earliest generations, which are preserved even in the Christian Bible.
One of the problems of liturgy right now is that particularly seasons like Advent are all predicated on a promise fulfillment theme. And so long as you have that, it's very difficult to not wind up affirming what Augustine affirmed, namely that Jews were no longer in the covenantal relationship. And how you put together that with the affirmation in chapter 4 of Nostra Aetate that the covenant remains ongoing, the Jewish covenant remains ongoing, I think is a theological issue that none of us have solved as yet on the Christian side.
Great, thank you. I think, Arthur, we do have a question online, is that correct?
We do, yeah. I was just going to read that out. It's in two parts. The second part is about social media, and we've talked about that a bit. But one of our attendees on Zoom asks, do you think that current anti-Semitic activity is related more to religion, more to ethnic identity, or both? So let me pose this to Rabbi Fish and Stephanie to see what are your thoughts on that question.
Thank you. I think Rabbi Fish touched on it a bit, so I'm not sure if this question came prior to his comments, but I think the Jewish community, we've always, like Rabbi Fish said in his opening remarks, we kind of people come at us from all ends of the persecuted Jewish identity of we have so much power, we're controlling everything, and at the same time, we are others, we are not white, we are dirty, all of those other anti-Semitic tropes. And what we're seeing in the United States and around the world is just a growth in nationalism, xenophobia, fascism, and those are all times when any group that could be marginalized or othered will be. Like Rabbi Fish said, the queer community, the Black community, the Muslim community, the AAPI community, we are all witnessing rises in hate crimes. Like I said, it shows itself in different ways in different communities. And right now, the Jewish community, there are significant threats against us. I'm not going to say there aren't, but other communities are being more openly, violently targeted right now by some of these groups. And many of them are white supremacist nationalist groups. And that's, you know, the most activity that we're seeing here in Rhode Island in an organized fashion is from those white supremacist nationalist groups. So that's my impression of what's happening, at least locally here in Rhode Island.
I think it's important to see how cause and effect is not always linear when it comes to human behavior, and when it comes to hate as well. So the religious dimension to these undergirding ideas about the Jew who is other, the Jew who might look like, might act like, might share the same Bible with you, but is somehow demonic, that idea does persist even as it's transformed over time. But what we're seeing today is not, strictly speaking, about religion per se. And that's one of the other issues. One of the ways in which the Jewish community gets othered and not recognized, not seen as who we are, is to say that the Jewish community is not quite a faith community, the way that phrase is sometimes used. Jews believe a lot of things. And some Jews don't believe many of the standard beliefs of historic and traditional Judaism. But the belief part of Jewish identity is clearly important, certainly to those of us who participate actively in Jewish religious life. But we are also an extended family, a community. From our perspective, and maybe this is a shared view within Christendom, the story of the Jews starts with chapter 12 of Genesis. As a family around Abraham and his descendants, and as a people, we begin a long time before we receive the Torah, before we leave Egypt and we receive the Torah. So that is actually a theological claim in a certain level, that our peoplehood matters. And that is sort of why Jews, for all of our infighting, tolerate one another, because we see ourselves as an extended component of this, if you like, mystical, or if you like, sociologically, just ethnic, this community that defines our broader identity, our broader being. So when on college campuses, for example, a DEI is asked, what do you do to protect Jewish students? They might think, well, we have kosher food available, or we allow them to put a mezuzah on their door, therefore we're welcoming to Jews. But what they may not fully grasp is, for many young Jews, and probably Jews of any age, what our identity means is something we're constantly wrestling with. What is our relationship to differently practicing Jews, to non-practicing Jews, to strictly practicing Jews? What is our relationship to Israel? What is our relationship to the stories and the rituals and the practices of the Jewish people? Everybody's kind of in the midst of working that out. But one thing's clear, no matter where you are in that complicated analysis, you're a Jew. And that is what young Jews carry with them. Often Jews who grew up with very meager Jewish education, Jews who grew up maybe with one Jewish and one non-Jewish parent, Jews who grow up with a racial identity, maybe a gender identity in flux, maybe a sexual identity in flux, but also carrying with them their Jewish identity as a core component of who they are. We're a little more like other ethnic communities than we are, strictly speaking, a religiously defined community. But what that means is, when hate is expressed toward Jews, there might be a use of these historic religious tropes, but they would be targeted and energized in ethnic terms. And so the question is, does a Jew belong in, let's say, Hungary, where there is a rebirth of nationalist exclusion, where Orban has expressly said, Hungary for Hungarians is a value, and he means it in a very narrowly defined way. So Jews feel quite uncomfortable in Hungary today and are quite uncomfortable with where things might go. What happens in America? We don't have a religious identity in America. America for Americans. What does that even mean? Well, for those of us who have very much felt American our entire lives, from whatever ethnic background we are, the question sort of answers itself. America's for all of us. We're all Americans. But for some groups, America for Americans means something very specific. I actually want to recommend everybody you listen to Rachel Maddow's current podcast, Ultra. It's very powerful in recalling just how close it came in the halls of Congress for Nazism and unity with the Hitler government to take place during the 1930s and 40s. It was really popular. You know, the largest march in Washington until King had been the Klan March in the 1920s on Washington. In the 1930s, there was a massive rally, pro-Nazi rally, by the America First movement in New York. These movements of Americans America for Americans has a long history. It's existed all over Europe. It exists over much of the world. And it is an ethnically defined American identity in which Jews don't belong. So do they use religious motifs? Yes. Is it strictly speaking a religious identity that they're speaking about? No.
Let me just add to that in terms of this media article regarding Catholicism that I mentioned in Commonweal, one of the things that's pointed out there is that a lot of these groups now are republishing and advocating the reading of theological works by a well-known Irish theologian at the time, Dennis Fahey. And Dennis Fahey provided the theological basis for the infamous Father Coughlin and for his radio ministry. So bringing back this literature is extremely problematical, to put it mildly, and so on.
The question is, do ideas generate the hate, or does hate go looking for the ideas that will give them support? We don't really need tonight to answer that question, but we need to identify when we see these forms of hate that are growing.
Is it on? There, it's on. First off, thank you all for being here tonight. It's been a wonderful discussion. The question I have really is almost about the elephant in the room. I know, Stephanie, you mentioned Kanye. The reason that Mr. West has gotten so much attention, as you said, is that he has millions upon millions upon millions of people who follow him online. And I can't recall who it was who said it, or where it was said, or even what context what was said, but I was listening to a speech some years ago, and it's always stuck with me, and the presenter was speaking about what's going on online, and he said, just imagine what the Third Reich could have done with Facebook. And that has really stuck with me ever since. Just imagine what Goebbels could have done with social media. And it is something that is refusing to go away. We have this debate between freedom of expression on the one hand, where we are lucky enough to live in a country where there are relatively few limits on what you can say. You obviously can't call it a bomb threat, but there aren't very many things you can't say and run afoul of the law. And yet, as soon as this platform is supposedly made into a free speech haven, the incidence of the most vile hate speech possible words I'm not even going to mention, increases by 500%. What do you think is behind that? And more importantly, as educators, what are we going to do about it? Because it's clearly not going away. And people eat it up. It appeals to base instincts. It is really it's a open ulcer that is just festering instead of clearing. And I'm curious what you think is going on and how we might begin to, instead of just dumping more salt into this wound, actually try to put a plaster on it and maybe get rid of it.
You know, I've brought up January 6th a couple of times, and although it's important to avoid politics when talking about fighting hate, it's also important to tell the truth, which is that there are very dangerous things that took place for our whole country that day. So one of the things I think we learned was that the Constitution is not a self-enforcing document. I bring that up now because I don't think there are any platforms that could construct rules that we would be particularly happy with that would stop hate, that is seeking to burst out. In fact, if you look, you know, every time there's a attempt to push hate down, there is an 8chan that pops up, or there's somebody else that pops up. What we see now is, I think, a proliferation of hate because the only real check that will work has fallen away, and that is cultural shock and horror at people expressing the kind of venom, the kind of ugly views that we've heard now so freely on our airwaves, from politicians, from cultural leaders, and from others. There should be shame. There should be shame when people articulate these things. And when there isn't shame, it's probably almost too late to rely on guidelines on Facebook, on Twitter, or whatever. Now, with that said, ADL in particular, but other organizations as well, have said there's got to be a price to pay. So it turns out that, yeah, Ye said what he wanted to say, but he's lost about $1.5 billion because there was a concerted campaign by a lot of decent people to say, we're not going to have a country where it's illegal to say horrible, awful things, but you're going to have a repercussion. And the repercussion is going to come from our social capital that we all invest in. You can't do that. So I think there were, over the course of the past years, and maybe in the course of the past decades, falling away cultural, gutters that kept the ball in the lane. We have to reconstruct those, and maybe some of this pushback against against Kyrie is about that stuff. But it's not something that's reestablished and done. Like any infrastructure, it has to be maintained or it falls apart. And maybe what we're seeing, whether it's in the case of backsliding within certain theological claims within Catholicism, or whether it's broadly in the culture, there is a lack of seriousness about these questions because we thought it was solved. Turns out it's not solved. Hate doesn't really go away. It hides until it has a moment to pop out. And the work of good people, of all faiths, of all traditions, of all races, is to do their own spade work to uproot those weeds within their own communities. Jews have work to do. Catholics have work to do. There's components of the African American community that have work to do. The Muslim community has work to do. We all have work to do. And everybody that's pointing across the barrier at somebody else to say they have to solve the problem of hate, I'm not going to do it because my side's fine. That's the problem. We need Democrats to talk to Democrats. We need Republicans to talk to Republicans. We need Jews to talk to Jews. We need Catholics to talk to Catholics. We need to talk to our own because there's way too much hate that we tolerate. And that is the beginning of the answer. The extended piece of the answer is organizational power exists, and those have to be brought to bear. probably not through legislation in all cases, but causing pain for people who look away. Right now, ADL is working very hard to get Amazon to take down at least the algorithm that keeps producing this horrific piece of anti-Semitic literature called Hebrews to Negroes or something like that. That's what Kyrie Irving was citing. That's a Holocaust-denying, anti-Semitic, terrible piece of garbage. But up till now, Amazon has allowed that when you put in the letters HEB into the search bar, that's the first thing you see. Amazon has to pay a price for that. And we all can make them pay a price. Even Amazon isn't that powerful. We all can force it.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think, going away from the organizational level and thinking about a grassroots individual level, I've heard a couple of interesting stories about how the Jewish community in certain ways is utilizing social media. Young people, influencers on TikTok. For example, I heard a story about a young woman who I can't remember her name. She has millions and millions of followers on TikTok. She posts about dance and fashion, mentioned very briefly in one of her stories that a grandparent is a Holocaust survivor. And the Jewish Federation, her local community, basically reached out to her and said, have you been to visit where your grandparents are survivors of? No, and they ended up taking her and her family there. She posted the whole thing on her TikTok and got, probably a lot more reach than any statement, any speaking event, any other thing that, the organized Jewish community would ever plan. I think there's acknowledgement now that young people are on the front lines of dealing with this in their social media spaces, and there's some really interesting young Jewish social media influencers that are being trained on how to talk about a Zionist identity, a Jewish identity, amongst all the other content that they're putting out, and also in particular how to respond when they start dealing with the kind of vitriolic hate that they will receive. I think when we talk about teens, other young people, those of us who have maybe young children we're raising to be Jewish, thinking about how are we training them and preparing them for what social media may look like for them is just as much of part of building up their Jewish identity, I think, now as probably a lot of other things that were part of Jewish identity education in the past.
We're coming up on 8, so maybe we can have time for one more question. If there's another question in the audience.
I'm on. Yeah, this will be a good segue into what I'm going to mention, and that is that one thing we can do, as we're doing this evening being together, next Tuesday at 7 o'clock at Central Congregational Church, which is on Angel Street, just above Hope Street intersection, we will be again having our annual Interfaith Thanksgiving service. Last year, we did try to do it in the midst of the pandemic. We kept the doors open, and so everybody shivered in their coats. I am hopeful that we will this year close the doors at 7, but this is an interfaith service. We have reached out to 13 congregations throughout the state. Certainly a number of our Jewish community friends are going to be there, as well as Catholic members, clergy and otherwise. It's interdenominational. We sing a few non-denominational hymns. We have a guest speaker who always comes from the non-profit community. You're in and out in an hour, and it's one more effort that we can all make together to share what we obviously understand is a common problem that needs to be solved. Thank you to the panel as well this evening.
And we all have so much to give thanks for. With all of these problems we're talking about, there's a great deal to give thanks for. So I think that's a great note to end on. I don't know if we're ending.
Well, I think it might be time. Although I want to take sort of co-host privilege here, and I just want to ask a quick question to Stephanie, just to kind of put some perspective on our local situation, as you spoke about earlier. Could you just say briefly what sort of interfaith collaborations, say, with the Catholic community here in Rhode Island, or with other religious communities in Rhode Island that you at the Jewish Alliance have worked and collaborated with against anti-Semitism, but maybe some other, one or two other areas too.
Yeah, sure. Very briefly, I mean, Rabbi Franklin's here. I'm sure many of you know him. We have a lot history of work with the Catholic community. And what I've been really seeing happening more recently is a lot of amazing interfaith work around issues kind of completely separate from, we were saying, religious identity, finding shared interests. There's a very active interfaith coalition to reduce poverty that has representation from a number of different religious groups in Rhode Island. We have partnerships. The Jewish Community Day School for many years had a partnership with the Muslim Day School, I don't know exactly what it's called, the equivalent of the Jewish Day School in the Muslim community. And I think a lot of Jewish people, just by nature of where they live, where they work, have developed relationships with maybe clergy in their neighborhoods. I know there's an East Side clergy group that meets in Providence. And, I think as other, we've been talking a lot, obviously, because of the audience tonight, talking about Christian-Jewish relationships, but there's a number of other religious populations and ethnic and cultural groups in Rhode Island, the growing Latino population, the Black community, the LGBTQ community, and, even in the few years I've been doing this, I've seen a lot of growth in those partnerships. And I think some of that is, like Rabbi Fish was saying, is that the Jewish community is a both and community. There's a religious component to it, and there's a very strong cultural, ethnic component also, and kind of building relationships around both of those identities are some of the things that are happening here, and there's a lot more to do. So if there are particular groups that you're connected with that you think would, benefit from some of those relationships, I encourage you to reach out to me or a local clergy or a group you work with, and we kind of all have to embrace this together because we can't do it relying on just one organization or one person.
Great. Well, I just want to really thank all three of you, Rabbi Fish, Stephanie, and Father John. And Father John, I'll say it was really an honor to have you here at Providence this evening. You've really done a lot of groundbreaking work in this area in your career. So thank you for being here, and thank all of the panelists for being here. You've given us a lot of food for thought, not only to sort of think about our own perspectives and our own view of our neighbors, but also how we can reach out to one another and ways in which we might be able to collaborate really against this sort of societal curse that seems to be, sadly and tragically on the rise. So thank you all. Thank you to those in our Zoom audience and our in-person audience for being with us tonight. The event, it was recorded, as you know, will be available on our website for viewing. And also I want to thank our committee members and, of course, college events and academic media services who helped set things up and helped get us through that glitch at the beginning. So I'm glad we were able to maneuver through that. So with that, I'd like to wish everyone a good night. And if you'd like to be on our mailing list and you're not, just send an email to jcte@providence.edu and we'll keep you posted on our future events. So thank you again, everyone, and have a good night.